If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Dr. Stephen Baskerville on the show. Dr. Baskerville is a professor of government at Patrick Henry College, where he teaches comparative politics and upper-level courses in international politics and policy. Before Patrick Henry College, he taught government and international affairs at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Palacky University in the Czech Republic. And he currently serves as a Fulbright Scholar at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I probably didn't. Among his many publications is Not Peace But a Sword, The Political Theology of the English Revolution, Taken into Custody, The War Against Fathers, Marriage and the Family. And his most recent book, and the topic of tonight's discussion, is The New Politics of Sex, Sexual Revolution and Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Governmental Power. Dr. Baskerville, how are you doing this evening?
Fine, thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. Is there anything you want to add to that, or did I miss anything? And did I pronounce that university in in Poland correctly?
Jagiellonian University. I was there for 1 yeyear. I'm no longer a scholar there.
Okay.
That was a very profitable year that I spent in Poland, yes.
Oh, you did? Okay. So how recent was that when you were in Poland? Hello?
Hello?
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. How recent was that when you were in Poland?
That was in 2015 and 16. It's 2 years ago.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So, I don't know. There's been some pushback in Poland with the from the sexual revolution, from what I understand, right?
Yes, it certainly has, actually.
Yeah.
And throughout Eastern and Central Europe, in countries like Hungary, and Croatia, and Romania, too, there's been quite a lot of pushback.
So the Berlin Wall did provide some protection, right? The Iron Curtain, rather.
Well, it's very interesting. The former communist countries have become among the most conservative countries in Europe, and they're very much in revolt against not only the European Union, but a lot of the cultural developments that have taken place in the West in the last, during the Cold War and since.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, tonight your book, Chris, The New Politics of the New Politics of Sex, the Sexual Revolution and Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Governmental Power. So let's get into this. You have it broken up into several chapters, of course. Politicizing sex, liberating sex, the politics of the family, And how do you want to address this issue, the new politics of sex, the sexual revolution, and how was it leading to the growth of government power? I'm reminded of Aldous Huxley's observation in, I think, one of the editions of Brave New World, where he said as sexual freedom expands, political freedom tends to decrease. And
well, that's very true. That's in some way one of the themes of the book. A number of scholars actually have written about this. E. Michael Jones points this out in his book, and Gabriela Kubi, in her recent book on the sexual revolution, also makes that a theme. But I push it further. I explore it and make it the central theme of my book. The relationship between sexual freedom and political authoritarianism is very striking. The sexual revolution began as a demand for freedom, for unlimited sexual freedom. Excuse me, as most revolutions do. They begin with a freedom, libertarian, a negative individualistic perspective, demanding simply freedom for the individual. But they quickly transform themselves into collective ideologies, or at least often they do, and that's what's happened in this case. The sexual revolutionaries, starting with the feminists and more recently with the homosexualists and the transgenderists, have started out with what seemed like very reasonable demands for freedom, for privacy, for being left alone in their privacy of their homes, to do as they please in their home, regardless of other people's approval, which, from certain standpoints, is politically defensible. But it goes beyond that. From the individualist and the negative freedom, they form collective ideologies, they form collective organizations, and they attempt to suppress other people's freedom. And that's very much what's happening here. Government functionaries, government officials have used the demands for freedom to increase their power in a number of ways.
You have the chapter Politicizing Sex. Now, how has sex been politicized?
Well, that's what I start out with in a number of ways. Again, we tend to think of many of the demands of the sexual revolution have been for a kind of negative freedom. I just want to be left alone. I want the government and other people to just leave me alone so that I can do what I want in the privacy of my home. But in fact, it goes much further than that. The government officials and political activists have used this sexuality, whether it's feminist sexuality or homosexual sexuality, as a claim to political power, as a claim to exercise governmental power that coerces other people. And there's a number of ways in which this is taking place, many, many forms. My previous book, was actually on one aspect of that, which I think is still the most serious, and that's the divorce revolution. And this is a good example of it in microcosm. The divorce revolution claimed to be a claim just to divorce, to be allowed to dissolve a marriage and to walk away from a marriage without the government forcing people who didn't want to stay married. But once you divorce, the government makes claims over, or even if you don't divorce, even if you are divorced passively and involuntarily and unilaterally, the government then makes claim over your private life. It makes claims over your finances. It makes claims over your movements. And especially, above all, if you have children, it makes claims on the ability to control the children, and through the children to control you. So government ends up being highly authoritarian, highly invasive, highly intrusive into what was normally considered the private sphere of life, how people live in their own homes, how they conduct their family finances, and how they raise their children. But with divorce, the government steps in and claims that they have the right to take supremacy and to make the decisions for you. So what appears to be a claim for freedom ends up being an entree for the government to enter your private life, take control of it, and in very, very authoritarian ways. That's what I described in my previous book. And after writing that about the divorce system, I began to see a pattern. I began to see that it wasn't just the divorce system. There were many other areas of politics and modern life where the government was making claims to control our lives. And it was following, and they all involved sexuality or the family or children. And so this purpose of this book was to show how this is a pattern, a large pattern in many different areas of life where the claim to sexual freedom ends up being a claim for government power.
So, yeah, the family, of course, the traditional understanding of the family and also the family, the bond being inseparable. You get married, and, of course, getting divorced prior to 1960 was rather difficult. You had to show cause or something. Now, with the no-fault divorce I guess that's what you refer to as the divorce revolution. It was the introduction of no-fault divorce, courtesy California and Ronald Reagan, the conservative Ronald Reagan, if I got that correctly. What you're saying is that the family structure prior to divorce was a sort of a bulwark or stumbling block to state power because it was considered inviolate. You couldn't puncture its sanctity. And so in certain relationships were outside politics, like the bond between man and wife and his children. And these, but once the marriage bond or marriage contract became reduced to a temporary arrangement, if one chooses, this invites government oversight. And guess when you talk about government intervention, intrusion, you're primarily talking about the family courts, which you detail in the book, are sort of unaccountable, correct?
That's correct, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes, the family creates a private sphere of life. I mean, obviously, every household should exist in a private sphere of life, but especially with the family, when children are involved, I mean, that's the one area of life. It's like a little polity. It's like a little society, which traditionally was off limits to government intrusion. And there are numerous Supreme Court cases that I could quote and do quote in the book, which have recognized this for decades. Traditionally, that there's a sphere of life that the state cannot enter unless it has a compelling reason or a show of law breaking in order to justify that. But since the divorce revolution, the government has claimed the right to enter the family.
Sorry about that. Just a bad connection. So, family as a private sphere, it's sort of a little, or a sort of a platoon, sort of, but separate from the state that could not be violated. And so this was an important distinction of the family. It was separated from politics, largely separated from politics. It's a private sphere. Government could have intrude, but the divorce revolution changed that primarily through the family courts. Yeah, you were explaining. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. And once that started, then you opened the family and the private household to government intervention. And it's especially important, I think, with the concept of parents and parental rights, because parents traditionally were the one authority in our society, other than the state, that could exercise coercive jurisdiction over another person, that is to say, their own children. No one else, but their own children. So parents and families with children, two-parent families with children, were a bastion of a protected zone that the state couldn't enter, and as such, they were the main limitation on the power of the state. Once you destroy that zone of privacy, you effectively make the state total. There's nowhere that the state doesn't reach.
And I think you make the point that is in your book. You write the traditional heterosexual family is the only family configuration that is compatible with a stable, progressive, free society, because it is the only one that checks the dimensions of the state. And this is why the traditional family has been targeted by the state. Correct?
That's precisely correct. I mean, we talk nowadays about single-parent families and same-sex families, but these are families that are created artificially, often by state power. Mm-hmm. In the case of single-parent homes, oftentimes the father has been forcibly removed from the home by the family courts or by social workers or by government officials, and the children have been placed in the custody. I mean, that very word, custody, indicates state-approved power. Custody is a term, as I use in the play on words that I use in the title of the book. Custody implies that the government, government-sanctioned control over another person's body, and in this case, we refer to children that way as having custody. But really, it's a conferring of power on privileged adults.
We have. Mentioning in the chapter "Liberating Sex: The Politics of the Family." Well, one thing you have, of course, the creation of the welfare state, primarily after 1960, And also you have the advent of daycare and these things. This coincides with the divorce revolution, the no-fault divorce, and also the broader sexual revolution that was sort of fomented in the 1960s through the culture, through the foundations and these things, the music, these things. How is it when you say liberating sexual liberation, and how has that politicized the family, destroyed the family as a private sphere, and created a situation where family law, the courts, all the litigation and problems, they're actually used to empower the state?
Well, that's right. You mentioned, first of all, the welfare state, and in some ways that was what began the whole thing. That was kind of what started the process, because the welfare state, which roughly started about 100 years ago or a little more, around the turn of the 20th century in many places, and then took off around in the first third or half century, was really the beginning of the principle that the state, that children and the family can be managed by the state on a regular basis. And so the welfare state created a huge extension of the power and scope of the government without really much debate about it. Whether the welfare state was looked upon in the American sense as mostly for the care of the poor, or whether you looked upon it in the more European sense of a more expansive welfare state that includes middle-class families, or really all families. The point is still the same. It represented an extension of the state, what we now call the nanny state, or the state as the caretaker, as a kind of an additional parent who had the potential to displace other parents. And the welfare state has begun many of the problems that we see. It created incentives for people not to get married. It created incentives for women to have children without husbands, without fathers. It created incentives for the fathers either not to be there or more often actually to be forced away. So that began the process of kind of sanctioning cohabitation and single-parent homes. And many of the institutions that later grew up in the divorce system started under the welfare system. For example, child support enforcement. That started under welfare. It began as a system not of providing for children, but of reimbursing the state for welfare payments. In other words, the state was paying for the children of single mothers, of poor single parents. And so the government wanted to recover that money, so they started going after the fathers to collect the child support. Well, that started with low-income families, but it quickly spread to middle-class families and families that were divorced, even when the father was divorced involuntarily, even when the father was perfectly willing to provide for his own children, either in his home or after the divorce. And yet the child support system began as this what seemed like an innocuous system of recovering welfare payments, but it became a monster. It became a huge incentive to spread cohabitation and single-parent homes from the low-income families to the middle-class families. And I described this in the book, and other people have described it too. So it's a very, the welfare state started many of these institutions. Another example, the welfare state also began much of the machinery to deal with things like child abuse and domestic violence. Child abuse is almost entirely a phenomenon of single-parent homes. There's very little child abuse that takes place in intact families with a mother and a father. But once the family is broken up, then you have child abuse. So the social workers and the child protective services began under the welfare state, and it began as a way of protecting or investigating the children of single mothers and making sure that they weren't being abused. Well, increasingly those same functionaries, the social workers, began to have an incentive to create more single parent homes, so they would have more jurisdiction. They became a kind of plainclothes police, is really what social workers have become. So they have an incentive to create more families, more single parents, more fatherless children, and to bring charges, often spurious charges, against fathers and sometimes mothers too, who have not abused their children. But it increases the scope and the power and the funding of the child protective services.
And of course, child abuse is routinely used in divorce proceedings as an accusation against one of the parents, and it's
Precisely.
it's become so routine that people don't even investigate whether they're false or not, nor there's any penalty for levying a false charge. It's just considered routine in these divorce courts, at least from what I understand.
Absolutely. No, you're right. It's so routine, it's so perfunctory that nobody takes it seriously anymore. Mm-hmm. It's like crying wolf. Yes, it becomes an excuse for the judge to separate the father out of the family because he claims he's erring on the side of caution. But of course, all he's doing is invoking a rationalization to get the father out, because until the father is removed from the family, then the judges or the lawyers and the social workers and everyone else, nobody earns any money. So that's always the first principle, both of the welfare state and of the divorce courts, is remove the father, get him out of there, because until he's out of the picture, as long as there's a father in the family, the courts and the government officials really have no justification for becoming involved. Once the father is removed, then everything kicks in. Everybody starts to make money at that point.
And you make the interesting point in the book how often people, conservatives, defend traditional marriage because marriage is there for procreation. Marriage is between man and woman, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and these defenses, which are not illegitimate defenses of marriage. I think there's a sound argument there in all those arguments. There's legitimate points they're making, but nevertheless, you make the point that what family really is, what traditional family really is it creates a.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, it creates fatherhood, and that motherhood is never a question. It's fatherhood which has to be sort of ratified and acknowledged by the family structure. And one trend I think that I noticed, and I think you write about in the book, is whether it's the welfare state, the family courts, and these things, they're cuckolding males. They're undermining male authority in the families, and they're destroying the role of the father in the family. And once you do that, you really destroy the family, because motherhood is natural. Maternity is never held in question. It's paternity which has to be assured by. Well, one thing is fidelity on the part of the mother. But what you're saying is they're destroying fatherhood through the divorce courts, through family courts, through the welfare state. And of course, once you destroy fatherhood, you destroy the family, and you set you're on your way to perdition, because it's the single family homes headed by mothers, which rely on welfare and they rely on the state, and that's when the single family setup primarily with the mother, and also the alternative family setups, all empower the state, because they all rely on the state to prop them up, whereas the traditional family is self-perpetuating and it supports itself. Is that a fair summation of your?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, fatherhood and motherhood are not symmetrical. They're not the same thing at all. Fatherhood is always much more fragile than motherhood. Motherhood is a biological fact. Motherhood exists in nature. Motherhood exists in pre-political societies. In societies where there is no social structure really of significance at all, and no political structure. Fatherhood is artificially created. Fatherhood has to be reinforced by the extended family, by the neighborhood, by the churches, by the social support network, all of these things. So, and of course, fatherhood has to be supported by marriage. And I make this point in the book, that marriage is essentially a way of creating fatherhood, that's the main social function of marriage. And this has been recognized in many works of political thought, both of conservatives and radicals. I mean, Freud recognizes this. Even Engels recognizes this in his attack on the family. And so this is well known. Hobbes points this out in his study of how civilization is created. So the fatherhood is much more easily attacked, and when it is attacked, and it becomes the first target of the courts and those who are trying to to basically occupy and invade the family. The first thing to do is to displace the father, and this is precisely what's happening. I mean, you also get single you get homes without mothers also, but more often it's fathers that begin the process. The first step in the process is that the father is removed. Sometimes the mother is then removed afterwards, and the children end up in foster care or without any family structure at all. So, it's the beginning of chaos. It's the beginning of social chaos. And not only that, but as I argue in the book, political chaos as well. Because all these other configurations of the family are supported by the state, and therefore they strengthen the power of the state. But only when the mother and father are united in authority over the family and the children do they have the power, the authority, the voice to keep the state out and to tell the state to mind its own business.
What role has well, obviously the sexual revolution did a lot to undermine the stability of the family, the no fault divorce, just the whole, I guess you could say, the whole environment or culture at the time was moving against these traditional notions of fidelity, lifetime marriage, and these things. And obviously the effects of that are clear. But you also get in the 1970s, well, this followed along with feminism. Of course, feminism followed along the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement, well, the claims of the feminists and the claims of the homosexualists are very similar to the basic claims of the civil rights movement. It's just equality, acknowledge us, leave us alone. But this opened the door. You write how this actually, the language of civil rights has been adopted by feminists and homosexualists, as you call them, to get a foothold in mainstream culture. Then as soon as they got a foothold of mainstream culture under the guise of tolerance, they became aggressive and started actually, infiltrating institutions, the courts, the schools, and these things, and started pushing their agenda. And in the name of tolerance, they become the most intolerant factions out there. Correct?
Well, that's right. Yes, they did very much piggyback on the language and the culture of the '60s and '70s, the civil rights movement, terms like discrimination and second-class citizens, and these became the cliches of the '60s radicalism, and we used these phrases in the civil rights movement and in the Vietnam War and the movements for campus and university reform. And the sexual revolution came along through this, and there was the hippie generation and the free love and all that came along, and nobody really understood what was going on because it was all during this time, as you pointed out earlier, that the no-fault divorce rules were brought into the courts, and nobody really understood what they were doing. Nobody paid attention. People's attention was on Vietnam and civil rights. Nobody really understood. Ronald Reagan himself admitted later that he didn't really understand what he was signing and that he regretted what he was signing. So everybody saw the culture, the hippies and the naked bodies and so forth, but nobody really saw the more profound legal changes that were taking place. No-fault divorce, the term was borrowed from auto insurance. Nobody really understood how it worked there, but or why principle for auto insurance could be extended to marriage. There was almost no debate on this at the time. A few voices from the legal community and others did speak out and said this. In fact, it was ironically for later on because it was some lawyers and some judges who initially spoke out and said this is a very unsound legal principle, that no-fault justice is a contradiction in terms. You can't have no-fault justice. The courts are about justice, and if they're not administering justice, then they're going to start administering injustice, and that's precisely what happened. To believe that the idea that you could adjudicate something like theft or arson or assault or murder, no fault, of course, is preposterous, or torts. Civil claims, even no fault, is of course preposterous. But that's precisely what we tried to do with the most basic and important contract in our society. And it violated the contract clause of the Constitution, which said that contracts have to be enforced. And here we were saying that the government could tear up a marriage contract without giving any reason. So it not only did it wreak havoc with the family and with the society, it poisoned the legal system. It introduced very pernicious and poisonous principles into the judiciary. And it began a very long process of judicial aggrandizement, growing judicial power, judicial abuse, and in a very basic sense, judicial injustice, which is the precise opposite of what the judiciary is supposed to be for.
And you make the point in the book that much of the sexual revolution was not a product of legislation or popular support. It was carried out through the judiciary and the governmental bureaucracies. So it was fundamentally undemocratic, yeah. I mean, Roe v. Wade.
Very much so.
Yeah.
A lot of it was brought about, yes, by litigation and by the courts and by the the bureaucracy. Now, there were, legislative, it was initiated sometimes by legislation. Of course, the no-fault divorce laws went through the legislatures like wildfire, almost no debate. Nobody really understood what they were signing. There was one suit I know of in Texas where it was alleged that it was presented as a divorce by mutual consent, and this was a very common misconception. People thought that it was divorce by mutual consent, but what it really was unilateral divorce, involuntary divorce, so that only one party could impose divorce on the other party and on the children. So even legislators were often deceived and didn't know what they were signing, what they were voting for. And then once this was through, the courts and the civil service bureaucracies took it and ran with it and used it to greatly expand their power and their prerogatives. The family courts became very politicized. They became open to pressure, especially from the feminist bar associations. And it was the feminist bar associations who wrote the no-fault divorce laws. They drafted them decades earlier, and then they were just waiting for opportunity to get it through. So no-fault divorce was not just some legal expedient somebody thought up, or somehow the feminists had been ready for this for decades, and were looking for an opportunity in the 60s when nobody was looking, when liberalism was, the month when it was to get this through, and it's taken this long to really understand the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Now, with we've had there's a certain amount of irony here, because with the sexual revolution, you've had, particularly on college campuses, but in the business world, life in general, you've had a very libertine idea towards sex being promoted by the feminists, by the homosexualists, by the liberal regime, if you will. But at the same time, in a reaction, then they turn around and pass almost like Victorian type speech codes. So there's been this repressive regime imposed to respond to the consequences of the sexual revolution. When people listen to the commands, of the sexual revolution, is to go out and be liberated and behave. You're free to behave any way you want because you're liberated. But then the moment they behave the way they're told they're supposed to behave, they're hit with all these, oppressive speech codes and other, I guess regulations on campuses. I wouldn't even call them laws, because right now a lot of people, because of this is chapter criminalizing sex, where you have the sexual revolution, then they turn around and create like the date rape phenomenon and the college campus speech codes and these things. And can you talk about that?
Yes, well, that's an excellent example of precisely what again, one of the themes of the book is the relationship between freedom and authoritarianism, and this is a good example. They pushed for this freedom, and these, especially on the university campuses, and they turned the universities in some ways into orgies. And then they came along and started making accusations, as you say, speech codes, basically heresy hunting. And not only that, but even more seriously, I think, rape accusations, false rape accusations against the male students. So first they practiced this ethic of complete sexual freedom, where everybody just goes to college and has sex. And then they started, suddenly the men woke up the next morning and they were being accused of rape. Now, everybody knows this, in most of these cases, it's not rape. But nevertheless, the men oftentimes have an enormous legal ordeal, trying to prove this. And this is a good example of it. One of my arguments is basically that sex, in any society, sex has to be regulated. No society can allow sexual chaos. And so what the radicals have done effectively, and I'm not saying they planned it this way, but this is effectively what's happened, is they abolished the traditional restraints on sexuality, the religious ones, the authority of parents, the control of parents over courtship, the codes of sexual morality issued by the churches and enforced by churches and by local communities. They ridiculed this. They laughed at this. They made everybody feel silly by trying to enforce traditional Christian morality. But then what they've done, having abolished all the traditional morality, they've come along and imposed their own definition of sin. They've imposed the political definitions of sin. They've abolished the Christian or the religious definitions of sin, and now they've imposed political definitions where the government defines what's sin. And when the government defines what's sin, effectively that means the government is defining what's crime. Mm-hmm. And so rather than social pressure in the old days, you were prevented from having extramarital or premarital sex by the authority of your parents, by the pressure from the community, your extended family, your church, moral disapproval. Nobody put you in prison for it. It was moral disapproval. But now, having abolished that traditional morality, we've reimposed a system of criminality on sex, which is enforced not by families and churches and communities, but by gendarmes, by police, by lawyers, by prosecutors, by social workers, by government functionaries of various kinds, who can fine you, who can take away your property, who can take away your children, and can take away you and put you in prison. So it's very dangerous what's happened. We've abolished traditional morality, religious morality, and we've replaced it with political morality and government morality. The government has filled the vacuum that the churches and the others have vacated. And
it's much harsher, much crueler, much colder than the traditional.
Yes, very much so.
And it's done without any. There's a book, I think it's called The Politics of Deviance by Hendershot's her name, and she writes the book that every society needs the concept of deviance to understand what's allowed and what's prohibited. We need these rules, and it's just a question of what is deviance. And what we're describing here, what we're seeing here, is with the revolutionaries are now imposing a new idea of deviance, and it's sort of a transvaluation or moral inversion we're seeing. It's almost satanic in a way, how what was once virtuous and considered moral is now considered immoral and evil, and just switches. Good example. Just a few years ago, we're talking about you in the book you talk about things like homosexual marriage and these things, same-sex unions, how now the rhetoric is to oppose that is to be a bigot, whereas the very people who opposed it, like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, just a few years before, were at least their public stance, were adamantly opposed to it, and now they came to support it. And so within 5 years, their positions a few years ago would label them a bigot. This is how the political rhetoric changes so fast.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Yes, and we're on a search for heretics and yes, it is very much a kind of a political religion, very much so. We have political sins, we have political heretics, we have codes on political heresy and political blasphemy. So yes, we've created a class of almost a priesthood now of political activists who tell us what we're allowed to say, what we're allowed to do, what we're allowed to believe. Which is far more repressive and intolerant than when it replaced.
Yes, and you what you're citing, these speech codes, these what's going on at campus where people are accused of rape. Of course, what we're talking about here is young men are accused of rape in many of these cases without any substantiation or proof. And when you talk about what's happening to the law is gone now is presumption of innocence and due process on these college campuses, where they can be expelled and they have their lives ruined. They have student committees that don't abide by any due process or any what we consider normal jurisprudence or legal principles. These things, it's just the accusation itself, and even the rhetoric. You talk about even the rhetoric, how these things are reported. It's always reported as it's no longer alleged, right? The alleged victim or the alleged is presumed that she as the accuser is indeed a victim, as if there's no such ever thing as a false rape accusation,
Yes, very much so. That's very true. And as you say, the initial victims of this, the initial targets of these witch hunts are, for the most part, men, young men. They're the main enemies of the feminists. Of course, the divorce courts, it tends to be slightly older men. But yes, on the college campuses, it is men, it is fathers in homes who are accused of domestic violence. I began to see this, but it's not only men; it's others too. Increasingly, I talk in the book. I talk about the parallel between these witch hunts and the newer one over bullying.
Yeah,
and bullying, of course, is really it targets adolescent children, and they're treated like criminals. Because they don't have fathers to control them or to protect them from bullies or to prevent them from being bullies. So we're criminalizing not only the men, the fathers, the university students, but we're criminalizing boys. increasingly. It's not unusual that nowadays women too mothers can be accused of these things. Mothers can go to jail and for non-payment of child support or for child abuse and things. So women are occasionally targeted for these things as well. And increasingly, with the rise of the homosexualist phase of this movement, we also see Christians are now complaining because they're in danger of being arrested or punished, fined, whatever, sued for traditional expressing their religious beliefs, which are now being construed as hatred or bigotry or homophobia or so forth. So it's spreading out. I mean, this is Dr. Martin Luther King's principle. He said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. So, we allow these injustices to occur in the family courts against fathers, in the universities against young men, and in the you name it, in the domestic violence courts against men. And it's not surprising that these people come out and they start targeting other targets, like Christians or religious believers of various kind, or mothers, or you name it.
Yeah, you're right that the principal threats to religious freedom in the Western world almost all come from the demands of sexual liberators, the radicals, the sexual radicals.
Very much so, yes. I mean, we hear a lot about campus speech codes and, the racial nationalists and so forth on the campuses, but I really think these things are minor compared to what the sexual radicals are doing. I know there's a lot of excesses on other kinds of radicals on the left, but I don't see them as anywhere near as dangerous. I think by far the greatest threats to our freedom are coming from the sexual radicals, the feminists, the homosexuals, the transgender groups, and so forth.
And so many of the problems that you mentioned, because once you dissolve or weaken the family structure, the two-parent family, it's almost like you release. It's almost like splitting an atom, right? And you release this energy, and it's uncontrolled, and just radiates everywhere. Because, like you mentioned, it affects diet, the explosion of obesity in children and people in general can relate it back to the weakening of the family, the ending, the rise of the two-income parent family. So people are eating out more, eating processed food, not eating prepared meals, not eating as well as they used to. They don't have fathers to discipline the young boys, so boys become bullies or they are bullied. And this becomes, and the therapeutic state steps in and passes these harsh laws, doesn't know how to deal with it, because again, these are things that civil society would have handled if the family structure is healthy, because boys are disciplined and they have fathers as an example, and they have stable families, so they're better behaved at school, and these are problems that the school can handle. And you don't have a sort of a hysterical media where in the past a bullying was maybe you might be enduring some fighting at school, and you, as a boy, you kind of experience that, and you learn to handle yourself, on the playground, and it ends. But as society breaks down, these things become more pathological, much more violent, and society can't cope with them anymore. I got many little fights when I was in school, and it ended after the 6th grade because you just didn't want to get hurt anymore. But it wasn't considered a bullying issue. It wasn't considered a federal case. There wasn't, any police intervention in these things. There weren't any police in the schools for Pete's sake. I mean,
right. Exactly. No, I discover every day. I discover new things, and I don't think it's not always obvious, the implications of this. The implications are very far-reaching, and they're not always easy to look the book to think of things which I was questioning, all the different ways in which the sexual revolution has had an impact on our society. One area I would to see someone else research away. When you double the size of the workforce, you're going to cut the wages in half. So, a generation or two ago, my grandfather supported 9 children. Nowadays, a man can hardly support a wife and 2 children. And when that happens, when women flood the workforce and the men's wages go down, the women have to work. Mm-hmm. They have no choice to provide for a family nowadays. So, and somebody pointed out to me, I mean, I'd love to investigate, or haven't seen economists investigate it, the way that, when the mother works, then the family has to buy 2 cars. The price of cars went up, and the price of car insurance went up, and more of the family household goes on. So, the supply exploded, and the roads everywhere, and the traffic, and these things. And, I'm not blaming women for this, because many women didn't want to work, didn't want to go into the workforce, but they found that they had to. And so it would be interesting to see how this was, how all the different ways. But it's very difficult for a scholar to investigate these things because, they're accused of so many things of misogyny or something if they suggest that these kind of
you cite that researcher
changes might be.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, now I can.
Okay. You cite that one researcher who just did that work on the negative effects of daycare on children. And he was run out of town, right? The obvious observation.
Jay Belsky, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was driven out of the University of Penn State. Well, this happens a lot. I mean, it's very common with researchers to be jobs, especially if they work for state universities, and are forced to go into the private sector. This happens all the time. So there's many ways in which this has influenced our society. I mean, increasingly, if you look at terrorism, much of the terrorism in Europe takes place, it's bred in these immigrant communities. And these immigrant communities in France and in the cities of Germany, these are communities where there are no fathers. So there's the mothers living on welfare, raising adolescent boys, who are, many come from conservative countries. They come to this country, and they suddenly find that they're free to indulge in sex and in drugs, and yet they can also at the same time adopt extremist ideologies. So, terrorism is being bred in these communities as well. Recently there's been a spate of articles. School shootings only come from fatherless homes and from communities where there's large numbers of fatherless homes. So virtually all violence, whether it's criminality or school shootings or terrorism, all of this is bred in families where there isn't any male authority.
Mm-hmm. And of course, in the United States, the high crime rate among young black males is directly related to the illegitimacy rate. Yeah, and that's the
absolutely. And this is it's so sad to see we're tearing ourselves apart about this racial issue. About police shooting young black men, and we continue this nonsense about how the police are blamed for being racist, and the police defend themselves and say they're not racist. But the problem is not race, and the problem is not even poverty. The problem is these boys, grow up without fathers. That's the single biggest predictor of criminality. A rich, white adolescent boy is more likely to get in trouble with the law than a poor black one. If the poor black adolescent has a father, and the rich white one doesn't have a father, the rich white one is more likely to get in trouble with the law.
Mm-hmm. Yet, the court's policy is determined to make sure that fathers aren't there, or at least decrease the chances that a boy is born into a two-parent family where there's a father at home to provide some sort of guidance.
That's absolutely right. Between the welfare state and the divorce courts, the government is engineering problems for itself to solve. It's engineering the very problems that expand its power. It's engineering the problems that break its budgets. These are exactly the problems: criminality, substance abuse, truancy. These are the problems that are breaking our budget, that are bankrupting the richest societies in human history. And they're all caused by government policy. Governments create policies which expand these single-parent homes and these adolescent problems. And then the government claims they have to solve them, and they need more money, and they need more power, and they need more intrusiveness. And it's a never-ending cycle.
Now,
most eventually, our societies have to bankrupt themselves, both morally and financially.
Mm-hmm. Yes. In the now, in your book, you also talk about the globalizing of sex. Now, this sexual revolution, it's become a policy of the U.S. government to export this revolution abroad in the name of democracy. This is done through NGOs, well, even done through the media or export or cultural export with Hollywood and the movies and these things. But how the U.S. government seems to be determined to go into some of these more traditional societies and promote feminism, gay rights, and these things.
Absolutely, yes. This has become a great emphasis, especially during the last administration. There was a huge emphasis on exporting these things, but it's been going on even longer than that. I mean, yes, the Obama administration, incurred the wrath of conservative Christians for exporting the homosexual agenda, but actually, the American foreign policy has been promoting these things for decades, even before Obama became president. We fund things like the United Nations, huge numbers of ferries of United Nations officials push policies in the global South, which are very hostile to families, which are designed to break up families, remove fathers, and to turn mothers and children into dependents, into clients of the global welfare state. And that's basically what the United Nations is operating as a kind of international welfare state. And this has been this has been going on. The no fault countries now have no fault divorce, and now the feminist lobbies are pushing them in the global South. They're trying to push them in countries like India and Africa, pushing. It's one of the first things they demand is no fault divorce, and in the Muslim countries, they're pushing it very strongly in the Muslim countries as well.
And this is all done under the guise of empowerment, right? The same way that was pushed here in the States, really. Empowerment,
exactly, yes. Yeah. So, exactly, yes. So this is said to be, that women need to be able to. It was sounded under the name of women's rights. I don't know why precisely divorce is considered a woman's right. Men can take advantage of no-fault divorce also, but this is the way it's always pushed. That many divorces somehow between women, although I still don't understand how that's the case.
Yeah. So this is being pushed in what's called the South, the developing world, India and Africa. I know there's the thing called micro lending, and these tricks to.
That's one example. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to empower women so they can be liberated from their men. And so what's being, again, it's the same, very similar rhetoric what occurred here in the United States, with the feminist and the idea of the feminine mystique and liberating women from their comfortable concentration camp and these things. But this is but what's happening here again? They're destroying the traditional male authority, particularly the authority of the male in the family, the father. And
that's correct.
And I guess there's certain politics. It inevitably comes from this, right? Obviously, if you look at the demands of the single family, and mostly, again, I've mentioned most of the single family are run by women. It's for more government, right? Subsidized daycare, government provided health insurance, and these things. And so, whereas the traditional family wouldn't make these requirements, in fact, there'd be probably generally the opposite type of politics, where they want to be able to earn enough money to take care of their family, so they're going to be resistant to high taxes and deficits and these things. But this produces a certain politics and government finance, which is ultimately unsustainable, but it promotes a certain socialistic form of government.
Well, that's very true. Yes, it becomes a form of kind of emotional and moral blackmail. Once you establish the norm of the single mother home, the single parent home, then anything is justified, because once you assume that once the single parent home, the single mother home is a given, once it's assumed that has to be there and it can't be changed and it can't be questioned, then the demands are unlimited, because, of course, the children are hostages. Everything is for the children. Everything's to take care of children, the poor children. And they can for a long time, they were peddling the falsehood that the man had abandoned the family, even when the man was thrown out of the family or evicted from the family by the divorce courts. Then they claimed he had abandoned the family, which is unbelievable that this kind of mendacity should be tolerated. But yes, as you say, when the Obama healthcare plan was brought through, the main lobbying group in favor of that was groups lobbying for single-parent homes. That was the main rationalization, that it had to be done for the sake of poor children. Nobody came along and asked the question, well, maybe if the mothers got married and stayed married and there was a father there, then the father could provide health care for the children. We wouldn't need government socialized health care. But this argument never came up. The conservatives didn't push this argument. I don't know why. It was a logical argument. They were forced into all kinds of, frankly, I think, silly arguments, less important arguments, because they won't tackle this. And this is another example, similar example, is the budget deficit. We hear a lot of people telling us about how awful the budget deficit is, how terrible it is, how we have to cut it, how we have to control it. And we hear this from very good economists will tell you all of the problems with it. But they only talk about how expensive it is and how bloated it is. But they're powerless to solve it. They're powerless to reduce the budget deficit as long as there's a lobby of single parents who can say, well, we need this because the children are starving. If they turn around and say, well, the children are not, first of all, the children are not starving. Secondly, the children, the problems of poverty are entirely connected with family structure. And as soon as if the mothers marry and the children have fathers, then the problem of poverty largely goes away.
Yeah, but the problem with that is if you address poverty by addressing the moral issue, then you're asking for the repeal of the sexual revolution, and they want sexual revolution. They want sexual liberation.
Right. Well, this is exactly my point. We have to confront the sexual revolution. This is my point. We cannot solve any of the major problems of our society today without confronting the sexual revolution. This is the elephant in the room that we don't want to solve. We don't want to deal with it in order to solve the problem of criminality, or the problem of substance abuse, or the problem of the budget deficit, or the problem of health care. I mean, all of these things could be taken care of if we simply face in the largest sense of the word, the sexual revolution. But we don't do it. So we're forced to do all these circumlocutions and all these silly arguments. And conservatives come across as sounding very silly and very foolish because they have to make somewhat preposterous arguments when they can be making sensible arguments.
Well, yeah, you make the point that the sexual radicals, their success is largely due to the misapprehension, gullibility of conservatives, not being able to confront the core of the issue here. Absolutely,
and that's another theme of the book is that many of these problems are easily. The mechanisms required for solving these problems are not complicated. I mean, to solve the problem of no-fault divorce is very simple. You simply enforce the contract clause of the Constitution, and you insist that people. The legislative requirements to deal with these problems are really very minimal. They're not complicated at all. You simply have to face the fact that we're being blackmailed by this lobby that claims that we have to do all of these very foolish and unreasonable and unsound policies, all for the sake of children who are poor. And in fact, there's no reason for the children to be poor in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And one of the problems of I guess the opposition, the conservatives, in dealing with this is that many themselves have internalized the sexual revolution themselves, at least the language, the lexicon, the public lexicon. We hear things like sexual discrimination, gender equality, and these things, sexual harassment, but things like sexual equality or equality of the sexes or gender equality. Even the worst use of the word gender is problematic when applied to physical human beings. But a good example is the notion that men and women are equal, that they're the same, that they should be participating in the workforce at equal rates, that performance should be the same. Not acknowledging the reality that men and women are different. They participate in life differently. They serve different roles. So you don't want equality. In fact, you have to rein in this talk about equality and say there are important distinctions between men and women. They serve very specific roles, and they're not in competition with one another. They complement one another. And I've always made the point that if you look at things like the wage gap argument, which is just silly anyway, because men and women don't participate the same in the workforce, so there's going to be a wage gap inevitably. But nevertheless, to the extent that the wage gap has closed since the 1970s, that's a problem. I think that's a negative index, a negative measurement, because that shows that as women have been thrown into the workforce, that they've been liberated from the kitchen and to go work for some corporation pushing paper to make Federal Reserve notes. Who's watching the kids? Well, the state is, daycare, the schools, and they're having less kids. So there's less people to support the next generation. This is a negative thing. So if you're going to accept the language of the revolutionaries, like such things like equality of the sexes in all things, you lose the war right there, because this is a situation that can't endure much longer without collapsing. And you enter into this world, what you called absurdistan. I thought was a nice word. We live in absurdistan now.
Right. Yes, that term was coined by the dissidents who used to live under communism, and they found similar things. The communist system, buffoonery. If you ever watch the old Czech films or the East European films during the communist years, they were always about how ludicrous to make life fit their ideology, and this kind of thing is happening too here. The same sort of thing, because as you say, these silly slogans about gender equality, and they create impossible standards that nobody wants to fulfill, let alone can fulfill. As you say, women make different choices about work. Many don't want to work full time. Many take time off from work to raise families and so forth. And everyone knows once a couple has at least one or two children, then generally the gender roles don't have children. Once you have children, then the gender roles appear, and the women generally are those who start taking care of the children, especially when there's several children. And so they're going to make different choices in the workforce participation. And this is they're free to do it, and this is what they want to do. And then to come back and say this is a wage gap is just absurd. Well, we're seeing this. We're seeing this. As I mentioned, this erosion of men's wages into tedious, dull jobs, which are not empowering and don't make them fulfilled. It just take them away from their homes and their families and enslave them, turn them into worker bees. And we do the same thing with children. We want to put them in institutions of various kind, daycare, preschool, kindergarten, earlier ages, longer hours, and more of the work is institutionalized. The children are being put into various institutions. The mothers are being forced into the labor force by taxes. The fathers have to work longer hours and spend less time with their children, less time in their homes, because they have to not only support the family. So everyone's institutionalized, and private life is eroded, and the family is eroded, and the private household is eroded, and I don't think anyone's happy.
No, and but again, this is all sold to us as liberation, as progress, and we don't want to roll back the clock, do we?
In the same way that Marxism was sold to us as liberation and progress, and that was another form of slavery, enslaving the working class and turning them into workers for the state, for the honeycomb. But this in many ways has some amazing parallels with Marxism.
Yes, it does. It does. And I think what's interesting is that the former Marxist world, the former communist countries, Eastern Europe, are now they appear to be the ones that are pushing back, or at least resisting the sexual revolution. They have for one reason or another, they retain some rather conservative ideas regarding the sex roles. Perhaps the final analysis, the Iron Curtain may have shielded them somewhat from sort of the modern trends of the West, the poisonous ideas of the West that really gained traction after the 1950s here in the United States. And
well, very much so, and this fascinates me. I've spent quite a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and I see this time. People who actually lived under communism have no illusions about what's going on here, and they can see the kind of things when the women are forced into the workforce, and we're forced to work long hours, and yet to try to have private lives at the same time. I mean, this has no romance for them, or they don't see this as empowering. And the people of Central and Eastern Europe are much more. They see the value. They see they're Christian. They have much more Christian values. They're less likely to be enticed by radical fads and so forth. And it's very healthy in many ways. And this is also true of the global South. The global South also during the years of decolonization, they too were. Oftentimes had radical ideologies forced on them in the name of liberation, in the name of anti-colonialism, wars of national liberation. And these wars of national liberation produce nothing but terror and endless cycles of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. They produce economic stagnation. They destroyed whole countries, villages, towns, families, living under these quasi-Marxist radical liberation movements. And they too, this is why much of the global South now is turning to religion. Some of them are turning to Islam. Some of them are turning to Christianity. Some of them are turning to cults. But the global South is also much more conservative than the rest of than the West is. And the West doesn't seem to be able to understand this. See why this? We seem to have this conceit that we are alone are the wise people of the world. And the whole rest of the world are just ignorant heathens that we need to civilize.
Yeah, as Madeleine Albright said, we see farther than any other nation. We know more than any other nation. So we reserve the right to go in and tell you how you should lead your life. And even for conservatives who may may show support for military intervention and abroad and these things in countries like Iraq, when they was occupied by the U.S. forces, the occupying authorities set up started playing pornography in the movie theaters. So it's not a conservative thing. If you're interested in, and so it's again, it's part of that, going back to what you're talking about, the sort of exporting the sexual revolution to this country, because all of a sudden now, if you're spreading freedom to Afghanistan or to the Middle East, does that mean gay rights and feminism? What does that mean? Because we ourselves have lost the idea of what freedom is in the West. So maybe we should get out of the business of exporting it for a while till we sort of sort things out here abroad and get our own house in order. What's going on here?
Well, yes, this is very peculiar. You're right. We do have this concept that we've been pushing for decades now. This concept of human rights. And, some of these human rights, I think there's a general consensus about certain things that constitute human rights, but increasingly there's an agenda behind human rights of pushing it into more and more extreme concepts that much of the world doesn't share. Yeah. And to just assume we can push this on people indefinitely, and there won't be some pushback at some point, that abortion is a human right, or that same-sex marriage is a human right, or that changing your sex, which is, of course, not possible, the human right, we're going to respond to this. People are going to push back against it.
Mm-hmm. And, here we have a situation now where, this stuff is being proselytized or preached or, I guess, propagated or in the schools and these things. And you have, you have this idea of children now who are being told that they inhabit the wrong body. They're, and so it's this gender, confusion. And of course, the very thing we're talking about. is a symptom or a cause of the breakup of the family, because these children are being raised in families where there's much more abuse and trauma. And one of the effects of abuse and trauma is sexual confusion, homosexuality and these things. And you can actually create more homosexuals if you create hostile or environments where children are traumatized or abused, and if they come from single parent homes, they're much more likely to be abused. So,
Yes, that's very true. And this is something I don't go into in the book in great detail, but I do make suggestions about it, because there is a fascinating parallel between, the growth of single parent homes and the banishment of fathers and the attack really on masculinity and all things masculine, and the increasing homosexual militancy. I mean, the direction of cause and effect may very well be in both directions. Because children. I mean, for years the standard explanation for homosexuality was an environment with a weak father, or a non-existent father, and an overly strong mother. And this is of course precisely the family configuration that is created by the welfare state and by the divorce system. So who knows what's going on here? It's quite interesting. There's fascinating parallels between. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I can't explain homosexuality itself, but there is a fascinating parallel between the homosexual view of things, the homosexuality, and political militancy. I mean, they both involve very problematic relationships with masculinity, and in many ways, this is one of the themes of the book. Also, is how politics is not simply a means to an end. They're not, the sexual radicals are not political simply because they want sexual freedom. The sexuality and the politics and the political ideology are interconnected very strongly. The hatred of men, the hatred of masculinity, the hatred of authority is part of radical homosexuality. It's part of feminism, and it's part of their politics. So in a sense, the sexuality and the politics are inseparable. They're not, one is not a means to an end. They are connected with each other. Another place where you can see this very clearly, I think, is in the politics of sex education. Sex education is not just something of teaching sexuality to children. It's also a opportunity to teach politics to children. Sexual education isn't just teaching sexual technique; it's also teaching political ideology. Gender equality and things like that. So it's again, it's not a means to an end. It's inseparable from the sexuality itself.
Yeah, it's almost the breaking down of the destruction of male and female. And obviously,
very much so.
I mean, you can destroy the feminine by making them go to work, because there's a brutalization that occurs when women have to go into the workforce and they are pulled out of the, dare I say, the semi-cloister of the home. So they're forced to compete in that world, and they become masculinized. Men become feminized. At the same time, when they're denied the opportunity to work and defend their family, or that role of defending the family, whereas that's a specific father role, male role, and that becomes confused, and they lose their masculinity that way. This also has effect on population, because well, you're just going to have less kids in that circumstances, because women are going to find men less attractive to begin with anyway. That women are drawn to men who are powerful. They can exert power to defend themselves. It's a natural and healthy inclination to have. Not, but these things are all confused. So you have gender confusion being promoted, which gets in. It's almost like going back to some sort of, it's a hatred of nature itself, which is almost one of the Gnostic heresies. So going way back into philosophy, but the idea that the creation of male and female was a mistake. And we have to,
Right, that it's something artificial or created by society. That's very true. And also, again, one of my themes is that these things are not only breaking down, but they're politicized, because the masculine role is not simply breaking down and being confused to be transferred to women. It's also being absorbed by the state. The state becomes the provider in the form of the welfare state. The state becomes the protector in the form of the domestic violence or the or the or an increasing police, increasingly bureaucratic police. So the state assumes the masculine function, and the father then becomes not only redundant and superfluous, the male, but in some ways he becomes a threat. He becomes a rival to the state, and he becomes basically. I mean, one of the things I say in the conclusion is that there's really no place for redundant men except prison. If the man is not the protector of women, he becomes the threat to the women. If he's not seen as a protector and provider, then he is feared. And this is why this hysteria that we now see about not only deadbeat dads, but domestic violence and rape, and that masculinity is equated with violence, which is, of course, contrary to all experience. So either the man is the protector, either the man channels his violent tendencies into protecting, providing for women, and defending the home against the state and the society, against threats to it, or the man becomes a criminal.
Yeah, and of course we see that
an outlaw.
Of course, again, we see that played out, illustrated most clearly in the black community.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, the black male, the young black male, is the kind of canary in the mine shaft. You can see that he's basically turned into an outlaw and a criminal. And this happens by both the left and the right. They both for different reasons, but together they've kind of colluded to turn him into an outcast, an outlaw, who has no place in society. So where does he belong? He doesn't belong anywhere. He belongs in prison, and that's all. And it's not just black males, young black males anymore. It's white males as well.
Mm-hmm. It starts to spread out, yeah. So, well, anything else? I think we covered it, or any other observations? Or
no. I suppose the main thing. I suppose if there's a hope, if there's a conclusion, another purpose of the book that maybe I didn't make explicit, but I try to bring together many of the different things that people don't look at. The conservative Christian groups look at certain aspects of the sexual revolution and they don't like it, but there's certain aspects of it that they don't deal with. They don't deal with the divorce courts. They don't deal with the rape accusations. They don't deal with the sexual harassment. And then there's others, the secularists, the libertarians and the secular conservatives and the moderate liberals. They don't look at the homosexual side of it and the attack on religion and the cohabitation and those problems. So this book is what I'm trying to do is get everybody to look at this sexual revolution holistically, look at all of it. And I'm hoping that our society, that these different groups that oppose different aspects of it, will start to see the value in other people's objections too, and join together and get this under control. Because the Christians by themselves are losing, and the secularists, conservatives, are losing, and the radicals are winning.
Yeah, and you write in your conclusion.
I don't think that's going to change everybody. Men, it's Christians, everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you, in your conclusion, you have a quote by Will and Ariel Durant: "Sex is a river of fire that must be banked and cooled by 100 restraints if it is not to consume in chaos both the individual and the group." So, it's a good quote.
Exactly.
So, well, listen. Well, thank you, Dr. Baskerville. That is Dr. Stephen Baskerville.
My pleasure.
He is the author of The New Politics of Sex, The Sexual Revolution, Civil Liberties, and the Growth of Governmental Power. And, is there any way people go to follow your work? Do you have a website or anything you want people to go to? Or
yeah, they can look at my website, stephenbaskerville.com.
Okay.
Is a book and recent articles that I've published and how to buy a copy of the book. And it's got some reviews of the book and some recent articles that I've published since the book and before the book. So I think they'll get a good example of what's going on there. And some excerpts. You can look at excerpts in the book there as well.
Excellent.
StephenBaskerville.com.
Great. Well, Doctor, thank you for coming on the show. I'll let you go.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And when I post this, I'll send you the link.
Please do. I look forward to seeing it.
Thanks
very much.
You have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
If my friends could see me now, driving round just like a film star in a chauffeur-driven jam jar, they would laugh. They would all be saying that it's not really me. They would all be asking who I'm trying to be. If my friends could see me now, looking out my hotel window, dressed in satin strides and two-tone daisy roots. If my friends could see me now, I know they would smile. Sitting in my hotel, hiding from the dramas of this great big world. 7 stories high, looking at the world go by. Sitting in my hotel room, thinking of the countryside and sunny days in June. Trying to hide the gloom, sitting in my hotel room. If my friends could see me now, dressing up in my bow tie, prancing round the room like some outrageous move, they would tell me that I'm just being used. They would ask me what I'm trying to prove. They would see me in my hotel, watching late shows till the morning, writing songs for old-time vaudeville reviews. All my friends would ask me what it's all leading to. Sitting in my hotel, looking through the window at the people in the street. 7 stories high, looking at the world go by. Sitting in my hotel, looking at the world outside. If my friends could see me now, they would try to understand me. They would ask me what on earth I'm trying to prove.